So thanks everyone for taking the time to join the Chase webinar series. I'm really happy to have Laura Lee Ross from Technion join us, and she's going to be the presenter of today's webinar called Designing for Human Behavior. It used to be a CEU accredited course, but I think it has since expired for that accreditation, right, Laura Lee?
Yeah. We were doing a flood of new ones, but what I did is just it's one of my favorites, and just revamped a little bit around the whole COVID conversation and why it will be important. Yeah.
Okay, great. So it's going to be a 45-minute presentation, and we're going to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. And please put your questions into the chat box, either to everyone or just directly to myself, or probably just directly to myself or to everyone, the two options. And also just a little housekeeping that we're going to be recording, or we are recording this presentation, and it's going to be made available on our website at chaseoffice.ca/events within 72 hours. So you can certainly request that for your friends or colleagues. And just also wanted to say our next webinar is going to be 2 weeks from today, and it's a CEU accredited presentation called The Coming Age of Telehealth. So that's going to be a very interesting one, and might want to be registering for that one early. I anticipate a lot of registrations on that one as well. All right, so for the bio for Laura Lee Ross. So Laura Lee is the workplace strategist and A&D market manager for Technion Calgary. Laura Lee has participated in the development and organization of key industry events throughout Canada, and has been a strong proponent of sustainability through her work as a Living Building Challenge ambassador and as a lead accredited professional. Most recently, she became well accredited and subsequently a WELL facility member, joining the movement to advance health and well-being in buildings and communities. Laura Lee continues to promote the value of good design, its influences on business and society, and its power to create positive change. So without further ado, Laura Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just had a heart attack because it said Zoom wasn't working, but you all can still see me, right?
Yes.
And hear me? Wonderful. Yes. I'm glad to be here today. Really excited to go through this session with you. As I said, it is one of my favorite presentations to do. It's interesting. It delves into my kind of geeky nature of wanting to know interesting things. So I hope I find often a lot of kindred spirits in our industry who also like this kind of stuff. So without further ado, I'm gonna get started. And I'm testing out my new Zoom little person in the corner mode. So hopefully it goes well. So I think it's fair to say that the last year's been unlike any other that any of us have experienced before, and hopefully unlike anything we'll experience in the future. You know, every country in the world, every generation, all aspects of our daily lives have been impacted. Oops, sorry. Just have to get my bearings on how to move my screen this way. So the pandemic has not just been sort of this medical phenomenon, right? Beyond the many lives that have been lost and irreversibly impacted, it's also affected individuals and society, causing disruption, anxiety, stress. I'm sure it will come as no surprise that the separation from our loved ones, our changes in routine, and the restrictive measures have affected the social and mental health of individuals across the board. There have been implications to our psychological well-being, for sure. You know, and many of us are still working from home. I see many of you calling in today. Lots of white collar workers are working from home. As a matter of fact, at the beginning of 2021, Stats Canada reported that 32% of Canadians employed were working most of their hours at home, compared to where we're at in 2016, which is about 4%. And really, many of the areas across our country have remained in various levels of lockdown throughout the spring. And but as vaccines continue, we do see the ability to return to the office really coming on the horizon. And we can look to, I certainly chat with my counterparts in the US a fair bit, and we do see the vaccine rollout there has been, a bit ahead of us here in Canada. And we are hearing of organizations that are really pushing for the return to workplace. So Amazon is saying its corporate employees could be back as soon as the fall, while other companies like Ford Motor Company and PwC and Facebook could bring their people back as early as this summer, looking into next month. And some companies like Uber and Microsoft have actually already opened their doors to employees that want to be back in the office. So it's interesting, organizations are at varying levels. It's kind of, we all left at the same time, but we're not all going back at the same time. But as plans to return to the office come to fruition, it will be more important than ever to pay attention to how people are feeling. So it won't just be a matter of organizations and leaders welcoming employees back. They need to actually, give some return to the office some thought. This shift may actually be a culture shock for employees who've become accustomed to working remotely. It will be important to carefully consider how to reintroduce employees back into the office, and perhaps more importantly to each other. I was on a call a little while ago on a group that's going back soon, and they were talking about needing some social interaction classes again, because it's been so long since they've had to worry about anybody else in their space. But, one of the main benefits of returning to the office is to reignite the more organic processes of connecting with people that we so desperately miss and want again. I'm just going to read this quote. "There's no doubt whatever about the influence of architecture and structure upon human character and action. We make our buildings, and afterwards they make us. They regulate the courses of our lives." I'm sure many of you have seen some version of this quote before. I think "we shape our buildings and they forever shape us" is one I've seen written a lot in our industry before, but so many of us are occupying very different spaces than we previously have been used to in our working careers. This collective experience, or maybe should say experiment, that we've all been going through will have left its mark. Many of us have become accustomed to the certain creature comforts at home. People are likely to have some different expectations around workplace once we start to return to the office. There has been much speculation in our industry and conversation about the office of the future and what will that look like post-pandemic, but it's not necessarily what my conversation will center around today. I would like to focus more on the people that will occupy these workplaces. We will look at some principles of social psychology that can be leveraged to help us understand what motivates human behavior, maybe even our own behaviors, and how we might use that information to help us in our design process. So most people make the mistake of thinking design is what it looks like. People think it's a veneer that designers are told, make it look good. That's not what design is. Design is how it works. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and I know many of you will have had to have this conversation with people who think your job is to make things look good, which it is as well. But really, when we're talking about designing for human behavior, I really do like to start here, because the understanding that design means creating something for a specific reason or a need. It's not just about what it looks like, but how it functions, what it's used for, and ultimately who will be using it. Specifically, it's to contrive or devise for a specific function or end. That's what Webster says design is. And this is certainly true of products that Apple develops. Their popularity is due not only to their aesthetic, but the intuitive ease of use and functionality of their products. If that didn't exist, if they were only beautiful objects, they would likely be less utilized than they are today. And Apple certainly employs an awful lot of neuroscience and psychology and information about human behavior when they're designing their products. So I know you all have understand what the design process is. You know, to design something, we need to know who's going to use it and what function of the product or the end result is. How do you get there? How do you know what you're designing for, and what specific challenge you're trying to solve? We've all, you know, seen a linear. I know in design school, I sure saw this beautiful, clean, linear design process map. But I think for most people, including those of us who work with clients, the process looks a little, might be something more like this. It starts off with a lot of chaos, so many different drivers, different client needs, you know, multiple client requests, and sometimes competing against each other. There's a lot of information to sort through in order to discern what the concept is and how to solve for the problem with the design solution. So getting through this process and getting through the chaos at the beginning in order to refine a concept and develop design that suits a specific function is really the basis of design thinking. And we have seen definitely over the past decade a real uptake or adoption of this kind of concept of design thinking. And this is, you may have seen this before, comes out of the D School at Stanford. And they use this process map basically for problem solving protocol, and not just in design, but also within all kinds of other fields, like the field of medicine, field of law, engineering, all kinds of different industries are using a process map like this because it does talk about, it's a proven and repeatable problem solving protocol, right? It's a way of helping people think through the challenges and devise solutions that best meet their needs. There are 5 steps in this process. So we empathize, we define, ideate, prototype, and test. And the first, I think, is the most important of all of these, which is to empathize. And empathy really is that basis of design thinking. So empathy is our capacity to recognize emotions that are being experienced by another person, right? The action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of others. Essentially, it is just this, putting yourself in someone else's shoes to understand their perspective and worldviews. And we tend to all be familiar with this concept informally, but don't necessarily always think about it as the formal part of the design process, right? And again, sometimes there's an interchangeability between sympathy and empathy, or people do that. But really, empathy refers to understanding or sharing that emotional state or situation. So sympathy is more of feeling a concern for the well-being of another and a desired outcome of a change of their current state. So for example, if you break your leg, my concern for you wanting to feel better would be sympathy. My trying to understand how you having a broken leg impacts your day-to-day existence. How do you move around? How do you drive your car? How do you get to work? How do you climb stairs? Putting myself in your position to try and understand your perspectives, your needs, and your challenges, that's really digging into the empathy. And you can see how if I'm designing a product for someone with a broken leg, the importance of that first step of understanding what's really going on and not just basing my decisions on the assumption that they would, you know, not like to have a broken leg anymore is a good place to begin. And if we're designing a space, a product, an environment, it's important to be able to understand that actual experience or the desired outcome for who we're designing for. What do they need to have happen? And I love this image just because that product actually exists. It's called the Empathy Belly. But so as we are moving back into the office space, and you know, the spaces that the pandemic shuttered up, you know, those are starting to open back up. And there needs to be some awareness that not everyone is eager to return, with concerns from health to rusty social skills to preserving this new work-life balance that some of us have discovered when their commutes have disappeared. I think we were just talking about that, Danny, not having to drive 40 minutes in. You know, people may be reluctant to give up some of that remote work setup that they've had. And every organization is going to have people at varying levels of comfort with the return. It's interesting, KPMG did a poll in, I think it was in February, that 54% of Canadians feel anxiety about returning to the office. So this was, back in February. And the fact is that people of color are likely to feel much more anxious, which is at 78%. And that's understandable given how COVID has really disproportionately affected them. And yet what's also interesting is that employees under 25 are also amongst the most anxious, with 75% of them, despite them being in the lowest risk group, which is really interesting. And it's sometimes our anticipation can be worse than the event we're anxious about, but doesn't change the fact that we're anxious. And I said earlier that part of empathy is being able to understand other people, what motivates the behaviors and decisions of the people and who we're designing for. Unfortunately, as humans, actually, we're not generally very good at this, which is kind of an interesting place to be. So one of the reasons that we're not good at something is something called the fundamental attribution error. So this is a social psychology term that refers to our tendency to attribute the behavior of other people to internal factors and attribute our own behaviors to external situations or factors. So we've all experienced this, right? One easy example is when you're driving, you're headed somewhere you've never been before, you're not familiar with the roads, you don't know the traffic patterns, you can't see the street signs that you're supposed to turn on to. And that could, result in you cutting somebody off or, having to go over 2 lanes really quickly because all of a sudden you realize you've come upon your turn. Conversely, when you're driving as well and somebody does that to you, cuts in front of you, what's your first thought? Jerk. Oh my God, what a horrible driver. What happens is when I explain my own behavior, I attribute it to the situation. I'm not familiar with the area. I can't see the sign. It's really hard. It was hard to read where to go. But when we think about the behaviors of others, we attribute to them being a jerk or a bad driver. And we do this automatically, but it's important because it taints how we see and understand what motivates other people to act the way they do. And this isn't to say that people always have great explanations for the things they do. Sometimes they are just jerks or bad drivers or not following the mandates and rules that are in place to help us all. But that more often than not, the situation or environment can play a bigger role in people's behavior, even more so than we think it does sometimes. And what's really important is to know this. And so overcoming this bias is important to really understanding other people's experiences. Just having an awareness of this tendency is sometimes the most powerful tool we can have to help us question our assumptions and to get us to the underlying issues, and maybe to dig deeper and ask more questions and try and actually come from a place of understanding. So I actually, when I was going through this presentation with one of my colleagues, she just went, oh my God, that's so triggering to see this image right now. And that's because our environment impacts us in ways we don't often think about or understand. So we hear about other people's actions again, and we don't take the impact of the environment into account, right? We've just explained that. That's that fundamental attribution error. So I'm going to use this pre-COVID example. For several years now, we've seen a rise in the case of air rage or, fights or conflicts taking place on airplanes, and our first assumption, and I will say I do this too, is to automatically think, oh my God, those people are, horrible. There's some sort of individual characteristic that made them this way. It's all about their character. But psychology research shows that things like crowding, high levels of stress, sleep deprivation, etc., can cause us to act in ways that we wouldn't normally do. Since 9/11, air travel's become one of the more stressful situations up until recently, but now there's even a new layer that we have to consider. But we really did, it was not surprising that we're seeing a rise in conflicts occurring. And I'm not trying to excuse or justify people's behavior, but if we have a desired outcome, which would be stopping people from getting on fights on planes, understanding the factors that influence those behaviors to happen in the first place are really important. It kind of becomes a powder keg. So is the fact that it is a fact that as airplanes became increasingly crowded, stress levels and conflicts increase. Could we possibly draw some same conclusions about where the workplace had been going, for the last little while when we talk about real estate strategies that focus strictly on individual footprints and increasing density without offering options? Something to think about. Just when people feel crowded, they often feel stressed, which influences their satisfaction in the workplace. And now again, we're going to layer in this new experience of needing to be socially or physically distanced from others. So the perception of space and whether a person feels crowded varies greatly by culture, background, individual preference, and gender. So there is that also to take into consideration. But again, as I said, we're now layering in the effects of the last year's social distancing requirements and the fact that we haven't been close to a lot of people for a long time. There's going to be a need to be far more cognizant about how people are feeling about their proximity to others, right? So an environment, I've lost this had an animation that very nicely changed it to a much more open space. So I apologize for that, but an environment that gives people a choice about how much stimulation is coming at them at any one time is beneficial for reasons other than just offering distancing, physical distancing. And I know many of you know that, and we've been working in that toward that way. And so much of what we've been hearing about probably in the last 3 years now, and I certainly have, is about diversity, neurodiversity within the workplace, and that sort of thing too, also impacting that. So we know that moving forward, it is an important thing to ensure that people have the ability to have more control over their space. And when we don't feel in control of what happens to us in a place, we are stressed, we are discouraged and frustrated. So offering that layer as we move forward is something that can help people feel more content when they're within a space and feel like they have more control. So feeling in control is the key here, right? We don't it's interesting. We don't actually have to act or exercise that control. Psychology tells us that we actually reap the rewards just knowing that we have it. I find that a very interesting thing. There's a woman that I love to follow. Her name is Sally Augustine. She is an environmental psychologist and an expert in how people perceive space. If you ever have a chance to hear her speak, or she's written several books, and she has a website too. I think it's called Psychology of, or the Science of Space. So she has some kind of rules of thumb, basically, about what helps people with this perception of space and crowdedness. Certain things that everybody here, I'm going to say, is probably very attuned to: lighter, brighter spaces, as well as rooms with ceilings or those that have walls and mirrors are perceived as less crowded. It's interesting to note that in the same conditions, men are more likely to feel crowded in a space than women. That is because men have better peripheral vision than women and are more likely to actually perceive or recognize that other people are in their space. And people who work in high-rise buildings actually feel more crowded than people who don't. And that, however, is slightly reduced when you are on the upper floors of a very tall building, because they're less likely to have other things impeding their view, and they have better access to the view in the daylight. But you can also do things like the perception of crowding can be reduced through the use of furniture, plants, decorative elements, or pillars. These objects prevent people from feeling crowded or distracted. And I know many people in our industry, or many of the designers I work with, employ that idea of neighborhood blocking within a floor plan to ensure that you limit the number of people that are in any in your line of sight at any time. There's also the idea of reducing the impact of a dense space by how many people you can see at any one time, but also providing views to windows, looking at having your circulation on the outer perimeter, relocating fixed elements to the interior. So things that many of you have we've been designing towards as well. But I think it will be so much more important to relay that to the organizations that we're working with as to why that is so important. So the human brain is designed to stereotype. It's a subconscious function that you cannot control. Actually, stereotyping is our brain's way of categorizing the environment around us without thinking about it so much, because most of what we need to concentrate on is our consciousness, right? We need to give that the most amount of attention. So this is all done subconsciously. And I'll give you my example here is why we're looking at a utensil drawer, is that I wouldn't open up this drawer and say, okay, I have 4 forks, 3 spoons, 1 spatula, 1 flipper. I would say I have utensils. Same thing with opening the door and I see my cups or my dishes and so on, right? This act of stereotyping is not inherently negative or positive. It's actually neutral. Unfortunately, we cannot magically shift our tendency to stereotype when we are considering people. So grouping people together based on differences is not unnatural. Where stereotyping becomes an issue is what we're labeling the boxes that we put people into. So unfortunately, you're not the only one in charge of the labeling of the boxes in your head. And that's when we're talking about then implicit bias. So implicit bias are given to you by your environment. It's not a conscious choice to have these bias, but everybody has implicit bias because our brain's tendency to stereotype. So these bias are being confirmed by our environment, by our community, our education system, our family, our friends, entertainment, media, and so on, you name it. Anything that you interact with on a daily basis can reinforce your stereotypes and implicit bias in your brain that if you're not paying attention to it. And that it isn't really important to remember, much like our fundamental attribution issue, is that we need to practice self-awareness and challenge our bias and where they come from. So some examples of this is, we are really good at generalizations, right? So we generalize people's behavior without taking other situational factors into consideration. So if I look at, something that we all often do and talk about, and I know our industry surely does, we talk about generational differences. We know we have a multitude of generations in the workplace, and increasing workplace diversity has some impact on terms of needing to design for a broader range of users, right? So all that information that we take in at the beginning when we're researching and trying to figure out how to solve for our clients' problems, the conversation does come around the different types of people in a workplace, as well as the traits associated with those groups. It is a slippery slope when we start generalizing vast cohorts of people. Obviously, these generational cohorts are 75 to 80 million. And of course, I'm going to pick on millennials and boomers right now because they have such vast and large groups. Gen Xers are, we're still squished in between and there's not enough of us. But what's important, again, is trying to design something for particular groups is understanding why these groups may have these behavioral traits associated with them, or what might be causing the generalization. So if you Google millennials, not so great what comes up, but conversely, not so great when you Google boomers either. So also, what's important for each of these groups is if we're really trying to design to meet specific needs is moving beyond the generalizations and understanding, right? What are the impacts or what are the reasons these behaviors are attributed to these groups? So thinking about some of the things with millennials being when we started more and more open plan, the push was because, they liked these big playgrounds and places that they could see everybody. But if you think about how the education system was working for them, there was a very big shift in how kids were grouped in classrooms, the type of learning they were doing. It was very group-based learning, very much leaning on one another. Lots of the conversation, as these kids were growing up was if you get a participation medal for showing up. So there's that entitled conversation that people have sometimes. Another generalization would be that shift in the workplace had the most impact on boomers, who were the most resistant to change, because it was hard for them to move away from the private office idea. So if we take this as truth, look at why that might be. For many organizations and a lot of people who've been in the workforce for a long period of time, the private office was the reward system. It was the status. It wasn't the space. It represented something completely different. It was recognition. So changing that model is not as much about the space itself as it is about the framework and how one is recognized within a company, and even how they recognize their own value. It was, again, part of the reward system. So the importance of moving from these generalizations to understand what motivates them helps us to be able to solve for the problems. So understanding where somebody is coming from and what's informing their behavior makes it easier to try and come to an agreement or a solution, or at the very least, have conversations around that and being aware of it. This is a great quote from philosopher Alain de Botton, which encapsulates the role that the environment plays in impacting human behavior. Belief in the significance of architecture is premised on the notion that we are, for better or worse, different people in different places, and on the conviction that it is architecture's task to render vivid to us who we might ideally be. And Technion had a great knowledge piece out a few years ago. It's still a book that I give to designers and design students when I have the opportunity. It's called The True Measure of a Space is How It Makes You Feel. And it really does look at what drives our behavior. We are different people in the places we occupy. And so the good news for design is that our behaviors are significantly influenced by the situations and environments we're in, often more than we give them credit for. Actually, and I worked for IKEA for a number of years, and I can tell you, man, you sure can make people do things you want them to do just by designing things a certain way. But what happens is organizational culture, business protocols, peer expectations, fear of judgment override our natural reactions to our environment. That is what I mean is that workplaces are not just the built environment. And especially now, as we are working in very distributed ways, and are able to perform much of our tasks remotely, the collective recognition that work can happen anywhere is likely to change the nature of the workplace environment forevermore. Workplaces are really a combination of three factors, all which influence each other. The people, that's your colleagues, your boss, your organization, organizational culture, that kind of, hey, this is how things work around here. Which, by the way, will be very interesting for those employees coming into the work office or the workplace, the office environment with organizations that they started with through the pandemic. They will have a particularly interesting time learning to navigate their organizations that they have known only virtually so far. But we also know that the technology that enables work to happen and the environment in which the work happens are also all what make up workplace. And it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. And that has rung true for millennia. Humans are incredibly good at adapting, and we get used to almost anything, good or bad. There have been a ton of research studies on what happens to people's mindsets when they're taken from good situations into not so good ones, but what their mindset was at the beginning. They adapt quite easily and stay on a rather level keel. There's a really interesting study on lottery winners and amputees, and talking about where their level of acceptance and adaptability is in their lives, depending on where they start before the occurrence of the amputation or the lottery. It's a very interesting one, but I won't go into that detail on that right now. But you know, working from home initially was exhausting, right? Then we got our routines and figured it out. Like first, we all pretty much thought we were going back to work in a couple of weeks. So we didn't get settled in too far, but then we had to. And we'll do the same thing when we shift back to the office or to a hybrid version of both. And after such an extended period of time of not seeing everyone, everyone should be prepared for interactions to be a little bit stilted at first. Some of our social skills have probably atrophied a bit. So there's going to be a little bit of awkward transition where we try to figure out both how to engage in small talk, but also how to have a conversation about more than just COVID, and also how to find the right words in the right sentences and to ask the right questions in the way we haven't been, right? And I have no doubt that the future of work will be more remote than it's ever been before. The physical office, however, which brings that benefit like connected ergonomic workspaces and opportunities for social connection and team building, will remain the core part of the future of work. And you know, as I said, humans are, we are really adaptable. When we're forced to accept new social and work dynamics, we do. We can adapt very quickly. We innovated new industries, we created new jobs and developed new ways of working through all of this in a very short period of time. And, you know, we do anything and everything we can to survive and thrive when things are against us. I fervently believe humans can and will adapt to the future of work. I am, however, concerned about the adaptability of businesses. So with over 40% of the global workforce considering leaving their employer this year, a thoughtful approach to hybrid work will be critical for attracting and retaining diverse talent. And this is it's a very interesting statistic that has come out from a high statistic that's come out from a number of sources recently about the number of individuals looking for new work, and not unemployed people looking for work, actually employed people looking for new work or new organizations. So in the face of the unknown future, organizations will really need to engage in more flexible partnerships, quicker responses, different modes of delivery, and new combined skill programs to effectively provide workers with the necessary tools, training, and work environments to successfully transition to this new normal. And, you know, what will that look like will be interesting. And again, I said I wasn't going to delve too deeply into that, but you know, this traditional concept required being in one place to access information and communicate with others. And this isn't really the office of the past. This is what a number of individuals will be returning to, is something that looks much like this, because we have so many organizations at varying levels of, as we moved into the pandemic, varying levels of management style, of technology adoption, of just organizational culture that either allowed people to work remotely or in different ways, or really had these expectations that bums be in seat and everybody be there, but more as the pandemic hit, what we were seeing was more and more organizations really, if not looking like this, working like this, right? In the past, if you walked into any place that sold caffeine and had Wi-Fi, you were likely to find individuals working on various mobile devices. They were not physically at work, but they were working, right? This is not the workflow, this is where we were in that moment when the pandemic hit, whether it looked like this or not. But how will this picture look 5 years from now? How does this change the role of the corporate office? This doesn't mean that, I don't think it means that it's going away anytime soon, because people need to be with people. But technology and how work happens is changing. Obviously, how work happens changed dramatically. And it's important to consider that this is going to impact the future. And finding out where people were most productive will be interesting. And can people be equally productive in different settings? Still remains to be seen. There were some interesting things everybody was saying, at the very beginning, people were, we saw a little dip, but then people were just as productive. But I think it was a very specific moment in time. Whether or not we can sustain that for any length much longer remains to be seen, right? And how things will look will be interesting. It will be for sure. This next great disruption at work is the hybrid workspace. And are we ready? I'm not entirely sure that organizations have taken a lot of time, have taken the opportunity, I should say, to look at this. This is some information that came out from Microsoft. So Microsoft immediately at the beginning of the pandemic last March started doing research on their use of their tools and technology. They have something called Work Lab. If you have a chance, you can go onto Microsoft.com/worklab, and you will find a great number of statistics and information that they've been accumulating through the pandemic. But I don't know if you can see the very bottom of my screen there, but 46% of the workforce is currently planning to move because they can now work remotely. We've seen this in Toronto. And you may have seen it in Vancouver, but definitely outgoing of individuals in high cost, low square footage space into suburban areas or further afield locations because they are working remotely. So why pay that kind of rent or money and be that cramped if you're going to be in that space? LinkedIn had an increase of over 5 times the remote job postings from March to now, or to actually, February of this year. There was 148% increase in weekly meeting time. It more than doubled for Teams users since February 2020. So we also saw an increase of emails delivered in February 2020 versus February 21 was 40.6 billion more emails. We are definitely moving in this more hybrid model, but there's a lot going on. How organizations will prepare for the hybrid workplace will require a great deal of coordination with employees returning to the office and others working from home, and then still those who toggle between both locations. Logistically, it's a really interesting option that organizations are really going to have to work hard at on how to figure out the logistics of this sort of working environment, and also then what that does to their real estate portfolio. Google, for instance, is planning actually their flexible work week. I mentioned they're looking at bringing people back into the fall. in September 2021, and they're starting it as a pilot program where employees would be expected to spend 3 collaboration days in the office and the rest of the work from time from home. So, what does that do if everybody's 2 days at home or Monday and Friday? Makes it tough. Or perhaps it is a strategy of choosing that everybody's working from home Monday or Friday, and maybe that makes it easier. When COVID hit, many companies around the world acted really swiftly to safeguard employees and to migrate to a new way of working that even the most extreme business continuity plans hadn't even envisioned, right? That the hope is that industries, leaders use this as this lessons from our large scale work from home experiment to reimagine how work is done, what role the office should play in creating a bold and being creative in bold new ways. There's no doubt that people are the engine that keep companies growing, adapting, improving, and innovating. And it is the people at which should be the center of the choices moving forward, and understanding that everybody is at a different place and has had different experiences, and really delving into what those are and how people are feeling about their workplaces is going to be an important strategy for organizations moving forward. As I said, that adapting is going to be much harder for the businesses than it is for the people. We've proven that we are quite adaptable. One of the ways that I think is a great opportunity for organizations is to look at the research, to look at frameworks that have already been established on how to ensure that a workplace is designed in a way that not only is physically safe, physically promoting the health and well-being, but also looking within their organization at their policies that speak to what the individual needs of those people are. And something like and whether or not organizations choose to do a certification and go through all of that process is, regardless of not regardless, that's the wrong word. It doesn't matter if that's the choice. What is available to all of us and to organizations is something like this, where it's all been researched and methodically put into the framework of which we can use to design spaces for the people that occupy them. So when we're talking about designing for human behavior, it is that idea of starting with empathy. Again, I said, I think many of us know and understand what empathy is, but do we always challenge ourselves to be, to purposely put ourselves in the shoes of the individuals that we are helping on a day-to-day basis? Ask the questions. What are we trying to solve for? What is the issue? And everybody has a different one. It's not just the issues or the requests of the organizations that we need to solve for. We need to solve for the needs of the people that will be in those spaces. And when I say dig deeper, it is about that reflective. This is a moment in time where we certainly can be reflective of what our organizations really are, how our cultures, the cultures in our organizations support the business we do, but also the people that drive our business. And really questioning some of that, this is a perfect time to do that. And how space can impact our behaviors and how we're feeling as human beings is truly important. And I know that is something that we look to strive to do, but also really ensuring that we are using a framework to think about all the things that might impact a person in a space. And then obviously leveraging the impact that the space has on it. So looking at how we are actually working and utilizing the space once we are there, and how people are feeling about it. And I find it really interesting. So many companies will put out reports and information, post a project and say how wonderful we've done and all the things that have happened at the project. I always really like the surveys that happen, because when somebody tells you they feel some way, you can't really dispute it. It is how they feel. And seeing the impact that space has on people, it will be interesting to see what the impact it has on people when they do return to the office. If it is that feeling of being connected and social and part of their organization again, or is it anxiety and fearfulness and stress because they don't feel like they're being considered within the space. That should be it'll be an interesting time. And I'm gonna end there because I know I had a time. I'm trying to be exactly on time. So I will stop there, but does anybody have any questions at all or comments that you want to share, things you've seen?
Super enlightening for sure, Laura-Lee, and yeah, depth into change, definitely the theme of the last 15 months, I guess, that's for sure, and certain the coming months as well. There are two questions that kind of have come up to me directly here. One of them is that what's the name of the environmental psychologist again that you had identified?
Sally Augustine, Sally, Dr. Sally Augustine, AUG. Oh, I gotta spell it in my hand. It's written here. The Science of Space or Place, I think is her. I can send that to you specifically. Her website. Okay. She's fascinating. I met her probably in 2013 through Cornet, which is an organization I belong to. She was speaking at a conference I attended and have had the opportunity to meet her a number of times afterwards. She does a lot of podcasts. She is a social psychologist who kind of fell into design, into the world of workplace design and how space and environment impact us as human beings. She talks a lot about the home and as well, but she's a fascinating woman, does great research.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. The second question, I'll try to summarize it a little bit. It's maybe a bigger topic, but looking for your insight or comments around balancing empathy with reality, since we can't give everybody what they want.
Exactly. So there is that portion of empathy of simply being heard. And part of change management is about giving people a voice. And there are ways that we can do that within through the change management process of not only having people have a voice, but also helping them understand the design intent and the outcome. And so bringing them along the journey, and a lot of times through the change management, there is an opportunity of self-awareness and actually having them come to agreement that the design and how things are being done, when it's thoughtful and intentional, it actually brings people to that the same place in the outcome. You're always going to have an outliers. There's always going to be individuals that are not part, you cannot make happy, for sure. But that process of having a voice and being part of the process is important, whether or not they're the hot tub they asked for ends up on the roof or not. Being able to say they'd like a hot tub on the roof can be as beneficial. It's like that idea of having a sense of control, whether or not you choose to exercise that control. Just knowing that you have it is theirs. Change management has to be a big part of it. You can tell, sell, or engage, and that's kind of the tagline of change management, right? You tell people what's going to happen. Here's your box. Or you're coming back to work on next Monday. We'll see you there. Or you sell them, hey, we've got a great plan for you to come back. Or hey, let's have a conversation about what coming back looks like. How are you feeling about it? What can we do to help your transition? What do you want to see? And involving in that conversation, right?
Great insights. Good. Any other questions? Any other brave souls want to speak up and go live with your question? And thank you, Mark, for sharing Sally Augustine's link in the chat so people could go to the chat and see that. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Laura Lee. You obviously have so much perspective and insights to the topic, and very much appreciate. Look forward to having you on future ones with the Chase webinar series. And just want to remind everybody, actually, 2 weeks from today, that's a CEU accredited webinar that it's called The Coming Age of Telehealth. So it's going to be a great one. And also want to encourage everyone to please, please, please fill out the survey that you're going to get in a few hours. And that's how we continuously get better, as well as continuously bring you the topics that you want to hear more about. So we go through those in detail and continuously look at the themes from one webinar to the next. But other than that, we're going to give you back some time today and end a bit early. And again, thank you again, Laura Lee, and thank you everyone for attending the Chase webinar series, and look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Laura.
Laura.
Thank you. Take